It's a story that in its simplistic form was innocent white girls, evil dark-skinned men, and the far right with no interest in helping the situation were wanting to exploit it.
It was through your work that Keir Starmer, who was then Director of Public Prosecutions, came to understand what was going on there.
The whole system, as we were beginning to realise, mitigated against any possibility of A, these perpetrators being prosecuted in the first place, but B, the judicial system was quite staggeringly unfit to look after these young girls when they were being expected to give evidence. It just feels all wrong to me.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester, that's on February the 24th. And finally to Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of those dates. The link will be in the description below. We're really excited to see you there.
I have been somewhat taken aback by the storm that has blown up over the past few days, triggered by comments from Elon Musk. I have been concerned by what seems to me to be an utter distortion of the truth. And I have a feeling that in certain aspects of what has been claimed, I'm in a position to set the record straight.
If there is one man who understands the grooming scandal inside out, it is that voice you've just heard. Andrew Norfolk, the investigative reporter for The Times, was on this from the very beginning, more than 20 years ago, living, reporting in the region in South Yorkshire. And he's giving us his very first broadcast interview, propelled to do so by what he calls the shamefulness of the political response and discourse around it now.
Welcome to the Newsagents. It's Lewis.
It's Emily.
And you've heard a lot, doubtless, already. We spoke about it a lot on the show yesterday, about this story, or rather kind of the confluence of stories that we've had of Musk, the online world, social media, fusing with this decade-old story, more than a decade-old story, of Muslim Asian grooming gang, something that has exercised for a long time the far right, but is now exercising Elon Musk, the Conservative Party, others, suggesting, as we were saying yesterday, that there has been a mass conspiracy. There have been so many lies, to be honest, misinformation put about this story over the last couple of weeks. And as Emily was saying at the top, it is very, very hard sometimes to actually see the light because very, very few people know this story properly. Andrew Norfolk really is one man who does, because contrary to what you've heard so much of, the suggestion that somehow the mainstream media was part of a conspiracy to ignore this story, it was brave, fearless reporters like Andrew who exposed it and brought it to the world years and years before many of the politicians or billionaires who are now talking about it had ever even heard of it.
Yeah, Andrew and his editor at The Times, who said, "This is so important, I want you to do nothing else for the next 4 months." And it has been curious because all our thoughts were on Andrew Norfolk when we first started reading and hearing the sort of Musk outrage on social media. And we contacted Andrew, who said that he'd been very uncomfortable with the kind of discourse that was coming out about this, which he felt was not about the victims at all. In fact, the opposite, that they were being used and almost re-abused by politicians trying to find their own political momentum through them. And Andrew is not somebody who, I mean, I say this with the greatest understatement, he's not somebody who seeks the limelight. He is an absolutely old-fashioned, in the best sense, sort of shoe leather reporter who likes to work in his patch and understand it well and report on what he sees and hears. He spent months sitting on his own in courtrooms trying to get to the bottom of this story. And he admits to us how uncomfortable it was when it first hit his radar because he didn't know quite how to approach some of the more sensitive elements that are so inherent to the story that he then went on to break. And Andrew decided that he would come to the newsagents and give us his first broadcast interview because of all the misinformation and all the, frankly, garbage that has been out there now because politicians won't leave it alone because they see it as a vehicle for electoral gain. Well, joining us now for his first broadcast interview since those interventions over the weekend is Andrew Norfolk. And Andrew, you and Julie Bindel were the very first journalists at the beginning of this investigation who really brought it to light, you for the Times. Why are you speaking up about this now? You've been pretty quiet over recent months. Why have you decided to talk about it to us?
I have been somewhat taken aback by the storm that has blown up over the past few days, triggered by comments from Elon Musk. I have been concerned by what seems to me to be an utter distortion of the truth. And I have a feeling that in certain aspects of what is being claimed, I'm in a position to attempt to set the record straight on certain issues, particularly when it comes to attacks on the mainstream media and attacks on the Prime Minister's record when he was Director of Public Prosecutions.
Just take us back to, I suppose it must have been, 2010, 2011, when you first started reporting on the story. When did it first come to your attention? And what did you... It's been much talked about that there was resistance in reporting it at the time. Did you encounter that?
I felt it myself. I joined the Times in London in 2000, but came back up to Yorkshire 2003 as the North East correspondent. And the very first time anything crossed my path was 2005. Anne Cryer, who was the Labour MP for Keighley, raised concerns about what was happening to two young girls in her constituency, what I now know to be a classic pattern of this grooming and abuse. I'd never heard anything remotely like it. I couldn't quite believe it was true. But the controversial issue from the start was that these were young white girls and these were young Pakistani men who were the perpetrators. And immediately the far right leapt on that story. Nick Griffin, the leader of the BNP, stood against Anne Cryer in the 2005 general election. There was a documentary, Channel 4 documentary, that the Chief Constable of West Yorkshire managed to get postponed because he thought it would cause potential for race riots in the run-up to local elections. I didn't know how to cover the story. It's a story that in its simplistic form was innocent white girls, evil dark-skinned men, and the far right, with no interest whatsoever in helping the situation, were wanting to exploit it. And I admit I looked the other way. It wasn't until 2010. Inevitably, over the years that had followed, my antenna was increasingly attuned when occasionally court cases would crop up from around the North and the Midlands. Local newspapers, you'd see a cutting or a story would be submitted by a press agency. And I couldn't help noticing what seemed to be something of a pattern where two or more men were being prosecuted for sexual offences against girls who were typically aged 12 to 15. The first point of contact was in a public place. It wasn't institutional abuse. It wasn't in the family, where overwhelmingly, and it's important to say this, overwhelmingly, the vast majority of child sexual abuse in this country is carried out by white men. Britain is still 80% white. You'd expect that. But with this particular crime pattern, where the first point of contact was on a street corner, in a bus station, in a shopping mall, and a befriending process was taking place, it seemed to me that I couldn't help noticing that the vast majority of the defendants in the dock were Muslim names, and that seemed very strange. And in the summer of 2010, I'd been up for a weekend in Edinburgh. I was driving back to Yorkshire. I had the radio on, and a court case was reported on the BBC. I knew nothing about it. 9 men from Rochdale had been convicted of offences against one 14-year-old girl. A case I knew nothing about. Men's names were not mentioned in the report. And sitting in my car, I thought, horrible feeling that I know something about these men without knowing anything about them. When I get back to Yorkshire, I'm going to look it up. I got back, and sure enough, the 9 names were 9 Muslim names. And that's when the next day I sat down, wrote a long email to my editor and said, look, I need time to look into this because I think there's something going on here, and I don't think anybody's either understanding it or acknowledging it. And they gave me 4 months research to try to understand more. And initially it was simply trawling through libraries, archives of newspaper cuttings, trying to find as many cases that fitted this very specific pattern of the point of contact being initially in a public place. And in the end, we found cases covering cities and towns across the north of England. There were 56 men who'd been convicted. 53 of the 56 names were Asian, and 50 of the 53 were Muslim names. And at that point, the question was, who do we talk to? So we tried to talk to police forces, to local authorities, to social services departments, charities who were working with vulnerable girls. Nobody would speak to us. Everybody, it was a wall of silence. The editor of the Times decided we were going to go ahead.
This was James Harding, was it, at the Times?
It was James Harding, and early in January 2011, the whole of the front page of the Times, plus 4 whole pages inside, was that story. And the headline was "Revealed Conspiracy of Silence on UK Sex Gangs." And then we said, pattern of abuse across the north of the Midlands, most convicted offenders of Pakistani heritage. Now, that immediately was quite explosive in its impact. Within a few days, the government ordered an inquiry. Jack Straw, I remember, the Blackburn Labour veteran MP, said that some young Pakistani men in his constituency viewed white girls as easy meat. And the phone started ringing at that point, and very early on, places like Rotherham and Rochdale became a particular concern because of what I was being told. Summons to meet the editor, James Harding, in London, where I thought I was going to get a pat on the back. And I thought that was going to be it. But instead he said, this is now going to be your full-time job until we at the Times are satisfied that every single organisation with a responsibility to protect children or to prosecute offenders, A, understands and acknowledges what's been happening, and B, have the systems and the training and budgets in place to protect girls and prosecute perpetrators. And that became 4 years of working solely on that one story, from early 2011 through to 2015.
And am I right in thinking that it was through your work that Keir Starmer, who was then Director of Public Prosecutions, came to understand what was going on there?
In those early days, I was spending weeks sitting often on my own in courtrooms, listening to trials. The whole system, as we were beginning to realise, mitigated against any possibility of A, these perpetrators being prosecuted in the first place, but B, the judicial system was quite staggeringly unfit to look after these young girls when they were being expected to give evidence in court. I sat, there was a case from Telford where 9 men were in the dock. And I saw one girl spend 12 days in the witness box being shredded by one defence barrister after another, who were allowed to cross-examine her in great detail about every aspect of her life. And the judge just sat there and allowed it. and that case collapsed in the end and had to go to a retrial. But I was asked to go to a meeting with Keir Starmer when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. He had appointed Nazir Afzal, who was the Chief Crown Prosecutor from North West England, who had been the man who took the decision to overturn an earlier CPS decision not to prosecute the men who eventually became notorious for the Rochdale crimes, gang grooming crimes. I went to meet him and Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer wanted to talk about what he was realizing was a system, a CPS system that was designed not to lead to the CPS approving charges when police forces, if they did, submitted a file for consideration of prosecution, because the guidelines that they had in place at the time, for example, said the victim should be giving a consistent account of what happened. These kids, often out of their head on drugs and alcohol because that's what they were being fed, gave a very inconsistent account. They couldn't remember what was happening to them. And a second aspect was that the victim would never return to the alleged abuser. Now, these kids in the early days were often so naive. They were seeing that initially it was often a boy a few years older before they were then passed on to older men. They thought they were their boyfriends. They thought they were in love. They often did return to the abuser 1, 2, 3 times before they realized eventually too late that their lives were being broken and shredded. So Keir Starmer, I sat with him and Nazir Afzal, we talked through this. He completely changed the rules. His decision led to a massive increase in the number of successful prosecutions across the country. For all the easy, cheap nonsense that's been peddled these last few days, significant changes were made. And for all the hatred of the mainstream media that is being so cheaply, easily thrown about, it was the mainstream media that kept writing about this until eventually Rotherham Council was shamed into ordering the independent inquiry by Alexis J, which in 2015 finally produced the extraordinary finding that 1,500 girls in Rotherham had been brutally abused, and that almost all of the identified offenders were from the Pakistani community. Rotherham's Pakistani population was less than 4% of Rotherham's, almost all identified perpetrators. And to this day, the most frustrating thing for me is that nobody has done the official research to understand why.
You've alluded to this, but one of the accusations in recent days from some, including Elon Musk, has been that Keir Starmer was involved in a cover-up, a national cover-up, and indeed that's why he doesn't want a national inquiry. What do you make of those claims?
I don't think Elon Musk and the concept of truth really are very familiar with each other. I don't think he cares. I have utter contempt for people who dip their toes into the water for cheap attention. He's the richest man in the world. Everything, it's all his plaything. It's all a toy. What is Keir Starmer supposed to have covered up? These crimes were taking place, as we now know, the very most recent, right through the initial, a Conservative government that preceded the Blair government, that preceded the Conservative government. Who was covering up what? What was happening was either people didn't understand what was staring them in the face, and that's not at a national institutional level. That's on the ground. Social services departments, police forces, local officers. The single incident that I was told about that initially got me into Rotherham, can I tell you about it? Because it is the symbol of everything that was wrong and that needed to be put right. Grandfather contacted me in that first 2 weeks after we'd done our first story. He wanted to talk to me about what had happened to his 13-year-old granddaughter. So he'd gone to school, turned up one morning being dropped off, but she'd not. She'd walked out of the school door and disappeared. The school rang her mother. Mother rang the police immediately. She'd gone missing. She was missing all day. It wasn't until the early hours of the following morning that Police received a phone call from the other side of Rotherham from a woman who'd heard a young girl screaming from the house next door. The police turned up at this house early hours of the morning. They found two young girls, half naked, drunk, in the company of several adult Pakistani men. The girls were drunk and leery and abusive. The police officers arrested the girls and put them in the cells. They didn't touch the men, they didn't question them, they left them in the house. That girl was held in the cells overnight and she was charged with being drunk and disorderly. Her grandfather wanted to know why that had happened. The fact that those police officers turned up in that situation, saw those girls and those men, and felt the appropriate course of action was to arrest the girls, for me was everything. A symbol of the complete lack of understanding of what was going on and the need for significantly increased training to understand those in the frontline positions to understand what action should be taken. And that really was what triggered me to keep pushing at Rotherham until eventually we received the vast file of confidential information which enabled us to reveal that police force, South Yorkshire Police, and that local authority had known for years what was happening. They had the names of the perpetrators. They knew the addresses of the people were being taken to. They had done nothing. And there was a cover-up, and there was an inquiry by Alexis J, which revealed that.
Do you think any of this focus is good for the victims of child abuse? Is this helping them now? Do you think that this will bring them closer to justice if that has still evaded them?
I guess I can't know. I cannot speak for a young woman whose life has been shattered. I have such huge admiration for those who did go through that and were somehow able to emerge on the other side, because the ones who were not completely broken, and believe me, so many of these girls who became young women had almost nothing left. They were used as toys for these men's pleasure, and in many cases, unless they were incredibly strong and resilient or had incredibly supportive families who were able to help them in some way, there was nothing left of them at the end of it. And the ones who have survived, I, I can't speak for what they would feel, but I do know that for many of those I have dealt with over the years, there hasn't been a sense of closure. But I'm not sure, after going through an experience like that, anything, and really any statutory inquiry is going to make you feel better or more vindicated. The ones who actually went through criminal trials and saw, the girl I worked most closely with in Rotherham, who eventually sat at Sheffield Crown Court, to see her abuser jailed for 35 years, well, that did give her a sense of closure and vindication. But she told her story before a jury, and despite, again, the cross-examination attempting to undermine her at every turn, the jury had believed her. And I think that's about as much closure and vindication as you're going to get.
So, Andrew, do you think, Kemi Badenoch has called for a new statutory inquiry, Robert Jenrick has, Nigel Farage has, your old paper, the Times, has done so. Would this help? Do you think there should be one?
I believe, and have done, what should happen is dedicated work be undertaken, despite the sensitivity, to understand why it is that a very small subsection of the British Pakistani community chose to embark upon, over decade after decade after decade, this form of sexual gratification, which for most people is abuse and exploitation of the very worst sort. I I don't believe the blame game these days will achieve very much at all.
And why do you think it is? I mean, you've clearly got views about what is happening. You've heard Robert Jenrick in the last 48 hours say that there are immigrants from alien cultures who don't share British values, and that's at the cause of what went on in that scandal. Do you agree with him?
I believe that for many young Muslims in this country, it's not possible for cultural reasons to have a normal, what we would think of as a normal boyfriend-girlfriend relationship with a girl from the same community because of very strict rules about arranged marriages. I believe one factor is in a town like Bradford, there is still a very large number of first cousin marriages where one half of the partnership has grown up in this country, and the other partner has come as an adult, whether it's the man or the woman, having been brought up and grown up in a completely different culture. And it's very different, very difficult for some of these young men, whether they are British men who are marrying a first cousin who's come over from the clan over in Bangladesh or Pakistan, to an easy, immediate relationship. And for a great many of these young men, the easiest way as an adolescent, as a young man in their late teens, early 20s, what it sounds very crude, I'm sorry, but if they wanted to have an easy relationship, what they saw as available were young girls, British girls, typically white girls, often from troubled backgrounds, not always, but it was very easy, far too easy for them to meet and befriend and unfortunately share around these young girls. And when you had institutions that either didn't understand what was staring them in the face, they just didn't understand it. They saw these kids walking out of a children's home, for example, getting into a car, driving off, acting as though they were having fun. They just didn't understand it. Now, on the one hand, there was a class thing there where police officers and social workers who would never have allowed their own daughters to be involved in such activity saw these kids, often from working class backgrounds. And in the infamous words of a West Yorkshire police officer some years earlier, said we need to realise that some of these girls are doing it as a lifestyle choice. There was contempt for, it was partly a class issue, it was partly a sexist issue.
Just to remind you, during that 10 years that you were, longer than 10 years really, that you were covering these stories, do you remember hearing or feeling the Conservative government at the time concerned? I mean, they're very agitated now. We're hearing from Jenrick, we're hearing from Kemi Badenoch, we're hearing from people who are seemingly outraged that this has been going on. We know it has been going on for 20 years. I'm just asking from your perspective, do you remember that outrage all the time you were reporting?
Why are they outraged now? They're outraged now because Elon Musk has been shouting about it without knowing what he's talking about. And we ran that very first story and it created explosive headlines in early 2011. The Cameron government immediately ordered an inquiry. It was conducted by the Children's Commissioner, who did a pretty appalling job, but an inquiry was ordered. When the J report was published in the summer of 2014, 15, was it? Immediately, there was a summit called at Downing Street, summoned various leading cabinet ministers, sit round a table with some of the survivors of the Rotherham abuse, with those who played a leading role in exposing it, and significant changes were made in terms of the priority that was given to police forces across England and Wales to giving a much higher priority to child sexual exploitation and gang-related crime. And the number of prosecutions hugely increased as a result. As Justice Secretary Michael Gove was instrumental in changing the rules on which judges could sit on these complex cases. As Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer changed the rules to enable more prosecutions. I genuinely think those individuals got it eventually and did their best to effect change for the better. And in many cases, we still have a very far from perfect system. And of course, abuse is still going on. And every single child that falls victim to these men is one child far too many. But to suddenly have this explosion of interest, it just feels all wrong to me. Don't understand it.
Why does it feel wrong, Andrew? Do you think that these people, Musk, British political figures, some of whom Emily's mentioned, do you think they're using these people, using these victims for political purposes?
100%. But with the far right, that's been the case from day one. The slavering thrills that people like Nick Griffin and Tommy Robinson after him get from what is their dream story, remember? Innocent white girls, evil Asians, evil Muslims. You know, I sat at Leeds Crown Court in 2006 for Nick Griffin's prosecution after he'd stood against Anne Cryer in the 2005 election. He'd given speeches which had been secretly recorded, in which he claimed that this was all part of some global Islamic plot to spread the caliphate by impregnating every white girl in this country. It's being used for the very wrong reasons and these girls who've been victim so terribly for so many years are being exploited all over again. And for now, politicians to jump on the bandwagon when they've been silent for so many years just strikes me as a bit shameful.
Well, we suspect that you listening to that had similar reactions to us, which was, I'm not sure that any of the presenters of this show have ever spoken less on this show, because we really didn't need to. And there was simply throughout much of that a stunned silence, really. He speaks so powerfully, so authoritatively, with such proportion, but still with such impact, because he knows this story properly, which is quite unlike, and is indeed passionate about it and passionate about the victims, which, to be honest, is quite unlike a very large percentage of those with the loudest voices who have been speaking about it, often, as he says, for their own purposes in the last few days. And I think what is so powerful about what he says is that he does speak about it with the sense that two things can be true at once.
Yeah.
That this is being exploited and has long been exploited ever since the genesis of the story by the far right, by the hard right, by those with their own agenda. And at the same time, that it is true to say, and it is not something that we should, and particularly kind of liberals, should resile from, that there was not only deep institutional, appalling acts towards these victims, but that was partly born because there was a squeamishness about the racial element, the ethnic element, and indeed there are questions to be asked about not the whole community, someone like Robert Jenrick is saying, not about the whole of British multiculturalism and more integration, but yes, about a proportion of a community of this country, that there are cultural questions around, and there probably indeed are still cultural questions around, and he speaks about that with such nuance and such authority.
I thought the honesty with which he explained his own squeamishness was really interesting. And this is something, to take you, as we say, behind the curtain. Sometimes a story comes at you and you feel so uncomfortable about it that you almost want to pretend you haven't quite heard it or you haven't quite understood it. And he was very honest about that when he said he'd been told about it by Anne Cryer, who was then forced to stand against Nick Griffin, no less, having broken this story in the first place to the Times, and how he had to adjust his own way of thinking. And I think there is something in the honesty of doubt which makes it even more powerful when you say, you know what, this had alarm bells written all over it, but we did it anyway. And actually, as has become clear from that interview, what he's talking about is not just the discomfort of having to talk about Asian grooming gangs, predominantly Pakistani men, but also of the police response to girls from children's homes, to girls who they thought were being leery because they were drunk and drugged by these men. And so it's not just about a kind of discomfort with race, but it is also about misogyny. It is also about class. It's also about a failure to understand a duty of care to people who desperately needed the forces of the law and the institution to work on their side, and found that it worked against them.
And you can completely hear the exasperation in his voice about not only people like Musk, also some politicians in this country as well, partly because you can tell that this is something that he has so much emotional investment in.
Yeah.
And as a journalist and as a reporter, how could you not? Having invested, a huge proportion of your career, your time, your energy, doubtless been profoundly disturbed by so much of that reporting, to see people come along who have had no previous attachment to it or interest in it whatsoever, out of nowhere, almost as if they themselves have discovered it. The absolute abomination of someone like Tommy Robinson. And let's be honest, as a result of what Musk is doing, and others who are suddenly, senior British politicians jumping on the bandwagon, basically almost kind of vindicating that idea that somehow this has only just been discovered, or that there has been some sort of big cover-up.
There's a little cottage in Mar-a-Lago, which is now controlling Conservative policy, Reform Party policy, maybe even elements of Labour announcements as a result of that. And that is a really uncomfortable place for all of us to be in, actually, and particularly, I think, for the real victims of this scandal, who just sort of see it being turned into a political football.
We will be back with more tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.